So far in this series, we have discussed Vikings and their exploration of North America several times. In fact, they are the only claims that we have discussed which actually end up being true. That of the establishment of Vinland as a colony around 1000 AD, and further exploration into northern Canada. So it's no doubt that in all these claims, they are some of the best explorers we have covered, which might be why there is another theory that suggests that after the Vikings colonized North America, they thought, what the heck, let's go to South America. Yep, that's right. According to some, not only did the Vikings have a foothold in North America some 500 years before Columbus, they were also making trips south, which brings us to the Vikings in South America theory, which sounds crazy at first, but at least in this theory, there is one weird thing that happened that is difficult to debunk, and that goes back to the Inca and their culture before the Spanish arrived. One of these was the strange custom of being mummified with their dogs. This would be discovered in Ancon, Chile by Professor Nering in 1885. After finding a variety of dogs in graves with their owners, he didn't think much of the discovery at first, but it would be French zoologists in the 1950s that made a startling discovery. The remains of these dogs were not, and could not, be from the wild dogs of South America. In fact, they were traced back to a prehistoric European dog known as the peat dog. The peat dog's alleged domestication is controversial, with some scholars suggesting they lived with early man and were similar to our pets now, while some believe they were the ancestors of the domesticated dog we have today, or even an extinct line of wolves. Regardless, none of that really matters with this claim. The big issue is, why are these European dogs found at burial sites with Inca in South America that predate Columbian contact? The anomaly gets even crazier when you realize that these remains were almost identical to 3 of the prehistoric dogs found in Denmark, specifically in one of the homes of the Vikings, which brings us back to the core argument of this theory. How did dogs whose lineage are traced to prehistoric Danish dogs end up in Inca territory? This was actually a fairly popular and controversial claim in the mid-20th century, and it became known as the case of the Bunso sheepdogs, Bunso being the area in Denmark the dogs were traced to. And the French scientists pitched the suggestion that when the Vikings landed in Vinland, they left some of the dogs with the other Vikings before they left, and then some of these dogs escaped and were found by natives in Canada and America, and were then passed or traded to other natives all the way down through South America until they found the Incas in Peru, who actually kept them as pets. And as you might imagine, this was thought to be pretty ludicrous, but it would open up the door for even crazier theories, like the Vikings must have sailed to South America with the dogs on board. A lot of this comes from the 11th century records, which document King Canute IV of Denmark in 1085 AD, putting together a fleet of 1,700 ships for, quote, Western expansion. According to these documents, this was meant for an invasion of England before it was called off due to problems back home. Regardless, the theory suggests that some of these remaining ships went on west towards the Americas, or possibly that the invasion into Britain was a cover-up all along, and that these special ships, which had been outfitted with a type of sail that allowed a quicker speed and greater distance, was used. And apparently, with this, the Vikings found their way to Santos, Sao Paulo, Brazil. They then disembarked and found a path that apparently had been long established, and made their way southeast to a location now known as Ama Bay, before reaching Cerro Cora in what is now Paraguay. It's here in the vast wilderness that the mountains create a natural area to fortify, and again, it's alleged that the Vikings did just that, setting themselves up high on a hill that allowed them to view down into the entire area. The fortress was then abandoned in 1250 AD, and most likely due to a native rebellion which forced them out. The theory then elaborates to an insane degree and gets more confusing, so I won't go into everything, but the highlights are that the Vikings made Tiwanaku in Bolivia their capital and set up the ancient path now known as Piabiru, which connected the northern and southern part of the continent and was later traveled by Spanish explorers. However, this crazy theory was largely based on the dog remains found and some inscriptions in the area said to be runic, but the dogs are more than likely just the short-nosed Indian dog already present in the Americas who shared a common ancestor with the prehistoric European dogs. And finally, those runic inscriptions were really just made by natives in the area, or at least the ones that weren't outright hoaxed. In 1992, German scientist Svetlana Balabanova would undertake a scholarly endeavor that would inadvertently turn the history world upside down. Her stated goal was to research how ancient societies used hallucinogenic drugs in their day-to-day lives. This was not new research, as it's long been known that many cultures in the ancient world partook in hallucinogenics, usually in religious or spiritual ceremonies. So it was here that she and her team would look at a mummified priestess named Hennet Taui, who lived around 1000 BC. It was her and 9 other mummies that would be tested for various drugs and produce surprising results, because while hallucinogenics were expected, the researchers actually tested positive for cocaine, and in 8 of the mummies, tobacco. Now what is the big deal about this, you might ask? Well, quite simply, both of those items are from the New World, begging the question, how did an ancient Egyptian woman who lived nearly 2,500 years before Columbus have drugs that were indigenous to North and South America? The test, as you may have guessed, immediately started a controversy, with many scholars coming out and crying foul. They would insist she and her team had messed the test up, that there was just no way this could happen. Because of this, the teams would test again with the most modern equipment available on the bones, tissue, and hair, and they all tested positive for tobacco and cocaine. Further tests were done in 1995, this time on intestines and a liver, which revealed that nicotine and cocaine were most likely ingested. She would continue her research over the next few years, and by the time she was completed, she had tested an additional 71 mummies, and 56 of these would test positive for cocaine, with the highest concentrations being found in the ones that died the youngest. So how could any of this be? How did they get a hold of these plants, unless they were actively trading with the ancient indigenous peoples of the Americas? Well, in spite of the decades of testing, in which have all confirmed her findings, many are still not convinced, and they offer up other theories, like archaeologists smoking around the mummies during the original excavation, because although this research took place in the early 90s, the tomb of Hennet Taui was actually excavated close to 200 years before this, as it had actually found its way to a museum by the early 1800s, and it's quite possible that the archaeologists in this time period just smoked like freight trains during the whole dig, and it's not a stretch to think they were also snorting coke while doing it. Which brings us to the other crucial point. Pretty much every test done since the early days of the research has confirmed nicotine, but not all of them have found cocaine, pouring water on the pre-columbian claims. Not to mention, the Egyptians kept records on just about everything, yet there is nothing recorded about traveling across the Atlantic to get these 2 plants. Then, there's issues with the cocaine findings too, because even in the ones that have been found positive, the amount there is super tiny, almost undetectable. And interestingly, as far as the nicotine goes, in the 19th and early 20th century, nicotine-based sprays were commonly used on mummies to keep beetles and other pests from infesting it. Lying in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean is a set of islands that we have referenced many times before, that of the Azores, whose location has long been used as a waypoint when traversing the ocean. Even now, it's often visited by airliners to refuel. The archipelago is an autonomous region of Portugal who gets credit for discovering it sometime in the 14th century, but no one is sure when exactly, as there are different claims. But it did pop up first on maps in 1351, and although Portuguese technically get credit, new information over the past few decades points to a much earlier settlement of the islands, specifically by the Vikings. In fact, there's some evidence now that they may have colonized the islands sometime between 700 and 850 AD. Some of this includes DNA found in the island's mice, which can be traced to the DNA of Scandinavian mice. There's also some evidence of large-scale fires used to clear up land for livestock from around the same time. However, none of these things have ever been conclusively confirmed, leaving the Vikings' claim up in the air. But what if the archipelago was discovered much sooner than that by an ancient sea power, maybe one we have talked about previously in this series? The Carthaginians, Rome's ancient rival. And would it be that unusual, really? I mean, we have already touched upon two famous Carthaginian explorers whose adventures have basically been confirmed. That of Hanno the Navigator in the 5th century BC, who definitely traveled to the west coast of Africa, possibly reaching even as far as Cameroon, while Hamilcar, the late 6th century BC explorer, almost certainly reached the northwestern coast of France, and most likely made it to Britain, the first of the ancient explorers to do so. So to suggest that Carthage had another explorer whose name is lost to time make it to the middle of the Atlantic, well, it's not unreasonable. But to get to our claim, we have to go to the tiny island of Corvo, the smallest and northernmost island of the Azores. It would be here in 1749 that something extraordinary was discovered, although the world would not know about it for nearly 30 more years. Its first documentation came in a series called The Publications of the Royal Society of Sciences and Letters in Gothenburg by Johann Franz Podolin, an expert in the study of currency and especially old coins. Johann would record in these documents that in 1761, when he was in Madrid, he met a historian as well as a fellow coin expert, Enrique Flores, who handed him 9 coins. 2 of these were gold, while 7 were bronze. What made them interesting was the 2 gold coins, along with 5 of the other bronze coins, were from Carthage, while the final 2 were from Cyrene, which was a Greek colony in Libya. According to Flores, the coins were found in 1749 on Corvo, in a black pot or vase, after a storm exposed ruins near the shore. Johann, who was no fool, closely studied the coins, and then he compared them to some other Carthaginian ones that were currently in the possession of the Prince of Denmark. It was here that famed historian Alexander von Humboldt would take a look at them too, and after some research, he concluded they were legit, and he stated that this was proof that Carthage had been making voyages to the New World. This would be widely believed for a couple of centuries, even showing up in the Encyclopedia Britannica, while archaeologists in the early 20th century would continue to use it as proof for Bronze Age long-distance exploration. Maybe there was even an ancient trade route where the Carthaginians stopped in the Canaries, then the Azores, and finally Portugal before looping back around, because the Phoenician and Carthaginian mariners regularly sailed around Morocco and knew the Canary Current and Gulf Stream. However, as you might imagine, not everyone agreed. Skeptics, although believing the coins were legit, challenged the fact that they were really discovered in the Azores. First of all, is the big hang-up of the claim. Despite the solid accounts we have of Carthage's travels to West Africa and Britain, there's not one document that speaks of their travels to the mid-Atlantic, nor has any archaeological surveys on the islands found anything earlier than possible Viking visits, leaving most scholars now to suggest that the coins were planted there by some of the earliest settlers in hopes of playing a trick on someone, only for Enrique Flores to be given them centuries later and take them for legit. There's even some speculation that there was a small settlement on the Iberian Peninsula in Portugal called Corvo, where the tin ore in the area attracted the Carthaginians, and over time, the story just got twisted, and the Corvo on the mainland somehow became the Corvo of the islands. But considering it is well documented that the Carthaginians did have 10 trade settlements on the Iberian coast, it definitely gives credence to the theory. Then, there's the whole sketchiness around the claim. Like, Flores claimed that the coins were actually sent to him, not that he discovered them. Allegedly, they had been stored in a convent in 1749 after a storm washed them out. After being held there for a few years, they were sent to Flores, meaning there was time for trickery. And we also can't forget one of the most legit explanations, that it simply could have been from loose cargo after a Carthaginian shipwreck washed up on the Azores. In the earliest segments of this series, one of the most intriguing pre-Columbian contact claims was that of the Vikings. And why is it so interesting? Well, it was nothing exciting like the alleged theory that the Templars were in the US hiding the Ark of the Covenant. No, the Vikings were just here largely to get lumber. But it's interesting because it's pretty much the only pre-Columbian contact claim that is 100% verified. But it's because of that boring reason of just collecting timber and other resources that makes it so feasible, and it's that trait that makes this next claim just as feasible. The Basque are an ethnic group primarily inhabiting the north-central coast of Spain and southwestern part of France, who's not only united by their shared culture and genetic ancestry, but also because of their adept skills as fishermen. In particular, they were the first people known to hunt whales specifically for commercial reasons, versus hunting them down as a food source. They started possibly as early as the 7th century, scouring the North and South Atlantic, and possibly even further, maybe even going to the Americas, specifically Canada, and fishing on their coast, and doing it centuries before Columbus was even born. This is a theory that's been around for a long time, although not as popular as many of the others we have covered, but it did get a little bit of publicity in the late 90s, after author Mark Kurlansky elaborated more on the hypothesis. He used one of the prominent traits known among fishermen that has been around since ancient times. When someone finds a good fishing spot, they aren't apt to let other fishermen know about it, and they will keep it a secret. This is even more the case when money is involved, and Kurlansky believed that the cod fishing and whaling monopoly the Basque were dominating may have came about because they were doing it off the coast of Canada, which, centuries later, would be considered by Europeans to be the best fishing waters in the world. If the Basque discovered this great source of income, chances are they would do everything they could to keep it secret, even if that meant they had to hide the fact that they discovered a whole new continent. But it's more than just a wild guess, and there's some history that could back it up. Like, we know shortly after the discovery of the New World, right around 1517, Basque fishermen had already started hitting the east coast of Canada. There's also the fact that Juan de la Cosa, a Basque cartographer and sailor, owned and piloted the ship Santa Maria on the first and second Columbus voyage, as well as drawing the first European world map, which featured the discoveries of the New World. Many suggest he already knew these lands were here, and he was just taking Columbus along with him. Actually, there were quite a few Basque that went along on the Columbus voyages, with the third voyage having 4 of its 6 captains being of Basque origin. And it's here some of these men would begin to imply that they had already been hitting this area for years, maybe decades, and they had chosen to keep it a secret. The most common story passed around was that it all started around 1375, because the Basque fishing industry experienced a boom starting around that time and lasted the next few decades. This is basically the origin of the whole entire claim, although some writers, of course, have taken liberties and added to the story, claiming other extraordinary things like the indigenous petroglyphs found all over America were secretly written by the Basque fishermen. However, skeptics point out there's not one bit of evidence that backs any of these claims, with the only real proof showing a Basque presence as early as 1511. More than likely, they were venturing further out than other Europeans, but it's not likely they reached the New World before Columbus. When one thinks of pre-Columbian claims, you wouldn't typically even consider Rome having any connections whatsoever. Even more specifically, Pompeii. Yes, the ill-fated city that would be destroyed yet preserved by a volcano, holds a secret that has long interested historians and scholars alike, especially those of the more fringe-minded, because it's in a floor of one of these well-preserved buildings that a mosaic existed, which has since been lifted and sent to a museum. The mosaic, at first glance, appears to be nothing more out of the ordinary, just a simple scene of a fruit basket with figs, grapes, and pomegranates. But there's one thing that sticks out as odd. In the upper right-hand corner of the basket, there seems to be a pineapple, and for those that are not aware, this should be impossible, because pineapples are indigenous to South America and would not be known about, which begs the question, why is it in this mosaic? This theory first came to prominence in 1976 when Associate Professor of African Studies Ivan van Sertima proposed in his book They Came Before Columbus that the indigenous peoples of the New World actually ended up in Rome via going through Germany in 62 BC, bringing the pineapples with them. The fruit and visit from these people left such an impact on the Roman aristocracy that the Miro was soon created to honor the occasion. He would also cite that Pliny's description of people from India was really supposed to be about these natives that had came across the Atlantic. Now, if this was just Ivan van Sertima's claim, then it could easily be looked over. But he also cited a botanist, Domenico Casella, who identified the item in the picture as being a pineapple, along with plant taxonomist E.D. Merrill, although he was not an expert in Roman art. But as you might imagine, it's heavily disputed by scholars of ancient Rome, who carefully point out that it's nothing more than a pine cone, which was a pretty common thing in Roman art from the time period, since many Romans would have eaten pine nuts, not to mention pine cones were often linked with fertility. Others believe that it could have been a fennel bulb, large acorn, artichoke, or some kind of unknown fruit, while only a few actually believe that the indigenous Americans were trading back and forth with the Romans. June 2011, the Yukon, Canada. James Mooney, a cultural resource specialist, was out doing heritage impact assessment work for a copper and gold company when he would come across a discovery that no one could have expected. As his team was working the earth on a location that was going to become a road, they would unearth a Chinese coin. And you may ask, so what's the big deal? Well, it's because these coins were obviously old, and once dated, they were determined to have been minted sometime between 1667 and 1671. So, what is the 17th century coin doing in Canada? That was the mystery. Because of the harsh weather and terrain, the Yukon didn't actually see European colonization until the 19th century, even though the British Empire had claimed it as their territory much sooner. But if we back up a little bit sooner, to around the mid-late 1700s, we know that Russian explorers were making their way through the coast of the Yukon to trade with the Tlingit natives, usually trading silk, weapons, tobacco, and clothing for furs. But that still doesn't explain how a Chinese coin that predates these explorers by close to 150 years somehow ended up here. Now, maybe a little surprisingly, these old coins are not that uncommon on the northwest coast of America and up in British Columbia, but there have only been 3 found as far up as in the Yukon, with the oldest being a coin mined between 1403 and 1424, which was found in 1993, which of course has led to wild suggestions that not only was there a much more expansive trade network than originally believed, the Chinese were already here with their communities set up. The theory piggybacks off Admiral Zhang He, who we looked at in a previous video, the famous Chinese explorer who is confirmed to have sailed to Africa and the Middle East, but according to many, also reached North America, which led to Chinese colonies being constructed in the Americas, in particular with our mystery, the Yukon. There are other claims, of course, that we have covered before that connect to this theory, like the bronze belt buckle from China that was found in Alaska. However, the most likely scenario is that the first Russian explorers simply brought the coins along to trade, and then the natives traded them amongst themselves further and further inland. When it comes to pre-Columbian claims, maybe one of the most intriguing involves 2 notorious and little-known pirates named Diedrich Pining and Hans Potthorst. If you have watched the previous videos, you may recall those 2 names when we were discussing João Vaz Cartier-Real, an explorer whose claim to fame was discovering and naming a region called New Land of the Codfish, thought to be Newfoundland. The discovery took place in 1473. It was a joint venture between Portugal and Denmark, and in that segment, we discussed the claim from Portuguese sources. But what do we know about this mysterious voyage, looking at it from Denmark's perspective? To get a better picture of why this voyage even took place, one has to look at the geopolitical landscape in this time period. Denmark and Portugal were in very similar situations at the time. Both were 2 up-and-coming sea powers who were perfectly positioned to not only take advantage of the fish trade, but also to act sort of as a guard to the trade going to the inland seas, the Mediterranean in Portugal's case, and the Baltic with Denmark. Yet, even though they were in perfect positions, they were both seen as the weaker nation with their neighbor who shared a very similar culture. For instance, Portugal, who is very closely related to Spain, would become the weaker power on the peninsula, while Denmark played the weaker partner to its neighbor, Sweden. So it makes perfect sense why these 2, who were separated by a good distance and really had no relations previously, decided to start working together over the next 50 years in their ambition to start a global trade empire. They actually started in 1425, almost 70 years prior to the Columbus venture. And in 1448, a Danish nobleman began escorting the Portuguese on their explorations of the African coast, on their attempt to find India. But it would be in 1472 that our claim would begin, because if you remember previously, we discussed the Viking colony that settled on Greenland close to 500 years before this in 986, and that colony by now had pretty much evaporated, maybe due to the Little Ice Age. Regardless, all of its inhabitants had left or died, and the former Viking countries, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, had not heard from anyone in Greenland in decades. Because of this, Denmark had launched an expedition between 1470 and 1472 looking for the Northwest Passage to China and India. After exploring the Arctic, they found nothing and came back. This is when Denmark looked at Portugal trying to reach India via going around Africa and suggested that the two work together to just try and locate a quicker route, thus outflanking both Spain and Sweden. From Denmark's perspective, they had the two perfect candidates to send as their representatives, Hans Pothorst and Dietrich Pining. They were given the order to go to the North Seas and look for new islands and lands and re-establishing contact with Greenland, as well as looking at several possible trading settlements and harbors that could be built in Iceland. What is uncertain is if they were really accompanied by João Vaz Cortier Real or if they went by themselves. Likewise, it's unsure if they stopped at Greenland, but there's a good chance they did. Regardless, the key part in all of this was one of the orders given to the two men by the king: investigate the land formerly known in the 11th century as Regiones Venetimi, translated to the coast opposite those still remembered but obsolete settlements in Greenland, or in a more simple way of saying, the shores on the other side of Greenland, near where people used to live long ago, though the places are now gone. So, what did he mean by this? Is this land Vinland, which may be Canada in northeastern US? It sure seems that way, but did they make it there? That is unknown since the sources are pretty scarce. However, we go to the next part of the claim, which suggests they did make a return to these lands in 1476. On that one, it's most likely again that they went to Greenland, as they reported running into hostile Inuit people, yet nothing suggested they went any further west than that. However, it would be in 1925 when a Danish historian, Sofus Larsen, made the connection that brought us this theory. He cited one specific letter sent to the Danish king in 1551, some 80 years after Pining and Pothorst made their expedition. The letter was describing the expedition, and it read that it was a Portuguese-Danish joint venture fostered by the common interest they had in cod fishing on the Great Banks. And while there is no Great Banks, there is a Grand Banks off the coast of Newfoundland, known for its great cod fishing. So taking that information and putting it with the king's order to investigate the former colonies west of Greenland, does that mean the Portuguese and Danish aristocracy and traders knew good and well about North America and had been doing a lot of fishing and whaling there for centuries? Meaning that Columbus didn't stumble up onto anything unknown? Well, it seemed possible, and actually, the whole theory prompted German historians to jump into the discussion, citing that both Pining and Pothorst were Germans who were employed by the Danes, so really, the discovery of America belonged to the Germans. Although Portuguese historians pushed back, and they claimed João Vaz Cortier Real was the main captain of the whole enterprise, thus, the Portuguese had discovered America. But the question remains, did any of this happen? That we still do not know. 1933, Mexico City. One of the most puzzling archaeological finds, or what many call an out-of-place artifact, was discovered, that of the Tekaxitl-Kalishikawaka bearded head. The terracotta head was most likely part of a larger figurine, and it was found along with a number of other objects made of gold, copper, turquoise, rock crystal, jet, bone, shell, and pottery. What makes it intriguing is it's alleged to be of Roman origin, and there's actually a considerable amount of proof that it might be. The director emeritus of the German Institute of Archaeology said, quote, "The head is without any doubt Roman, and the lab analysis has confirmed that it is ancient. The stylistic examination tells us more precisely that it is a Roman work from around 2nd century AD, and the hairstyle and shape of the beard present the typical traits of the Severian emperors." A thermoluminescence test was also performed on the head in 1995, and it was found to have been created sometime between the 9th century BC and the middle of the 13th century AD, which is an absolutely huge window of time. But it does confirm that it was made before Spain arrived in the New World. So how did it end up in Mexico City, since the Romans had no knowledge of the New World? Allegedly. One theory is that the whole thing was a hoax. According to a story about the discovery, the whole thing just comes down to a prank by one archaeologist on another. However, that has never been confirmed and has always just been hearsay. Another theory states that since this was a burial site that was dated to 1476 to 1510, then it's conceivable one of the early European visitors, like very early from Spain, could have brought it along with him and then died during the exploration and was buried with the head. This would have had to have been pretty early though. It may have even been traded with the natives during Columbus's voyage and then found its way to Mexico City. However, and this is where our pre-Columbian theory comes in, some say it could have been brought over centuries before, even before the Vikings. And if you consider that, it opens up the door for more similar theories, like the possibility that it was brought over by an Indian or Chinese trading ship, which had come into possession of it through trade with the Europeans, while a more simple theory states that after a Roman shipwreck, some part of the ship remained intact and got caught in the Atlantic current and pushed to Mexico, where it was washed ashore and taken by one of the local natives. And that brings us to the end of this installment of the Pre-Columbian Contact series. I hope you guys enjoyed. Goodbye and good night.